So throughout this month of September, we've been looking at stories from the Bible about people who have sensed God's call in their lives and who have followed that call. These call stories have demonstrated to us the variety of ways in which God calls us and the variety of things to which a person can be called. So we began this series with the story of Samuel. And Samuel was dedicated to the Lord's service before he was even born. But he experienced God's particular call on his life when he was a young man. And his story reminded us that we need to pay attention, we need to listen for God's call, and we need to be ready to answer when we sense God calling us. And then the next week, our story was the story of Ruth. And although the book of Ruth never mentions God explicitly, Ruth clearly sensed a calling to continue her commitment to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Ruth left the familiarity of her homeland in order to respond to that sense of calling. And her story reminds us that God's call may have to do with our family or our relationships, not just simply our call being involved with our vocation or our employment or things we do with our time. Last week, we looked at the story of Lydia. And Lydia was a strong, independent businesswoman. And after hearing Paul share the gospel, Lydia responded by being baptized, and her whole family was baptized. And her calling was to offer her resources, her home, her connections, her finances, all to support the work of God in the world. Through Lydia, Paul and other Christian leaders had a place to stay and a base of operations in Lydia's town. God did not call Lydia to change her profession. God simply called Lydia to support the Christian movement in the ways that she could. Well, this morning we're looking at the story of Isaiah. And his call story involves a really powerful, kind of crazy experience of God. Isaiah has this vision in which he sees the Lord on a throne, and the Lord is surrounded by angels with 3 sets of wings each. And one of these creatures calls to another one of them, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." And at the sound of that voice, the house shook and it was filled with smoke. And Isaiah was terrified. Isaiah says, "Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Seeing this vision fills Isaiah with despair. He knows that he's not the kind of person that you'd think God would want to do anything with. Woe is me, Isaiah says. And Isaiah knows that the people around him are not the kind of folk that God would necessarily be all that pleased with either. And yet Isaiah has seen God. And in that time, to see God face to face would result in death. So what was going to happen to Isaiah? And as he's wondering all of this, an angel flies over to him with a burning coal in the tongs. And it touches Isaiah's mouth and lips with this burning coal. And the angel says that is a cleansing moment, a cleansing by fire that would blot out Isaiah's sin and erase his guilt. Isaiah is no longer unclean. He's no longer unworthy to stand in God's presence. And then Isaiah hears the Lord. He overhears the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send?" And Isaiah, freshly absolved, freshly relieved of his guilt, says, "Here am I, Lord, send me." Interestingly, though, Isaiah's call comes not in the form of a divine command. "Isaiah, this is what you shall do." No, that's not what happens. Isaiah's call comes in the form of a question. The question isn't even addressed to Isaiah. The scripture says that the Lord is speaking to the heavenly council. Isaiah overhears this conversation, overhears what God is saying, overhears God saying, who are we going to send? And Isaiah, as if he's overwhelmed with gratitude at having been forgiven, he cannot help but reply, here I am. Pick me, Lord, pick me. I'll go. For Isaiah, there is no hesitation about following his call, like we hear in other call stories. There are no excuses of why he can't or shouldn't follow God's call. There are no contingencies or what ifs to Isaiah's response. Isaiah is ready to go. Here I am. Pick me. I'll go. So we have Isaiah and Lydia and Ruth and Samuel, and then we continue through the Bible, Adam and Abraham and Moses and Joshua and Jonah and Peter and James and John and the other disciples, Matthias, Paul, Barnabas, Stephen, non-biblical folks like Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, Martin Luther King in more modern day times. All have been called, including me and including you. God has been calling people of faith since the very beginning of time. Each of us has a call that is unique to who we are. Each call is unique to the individual and the individual circumstances of the one God is calling. And each person, each one of us, responds in different ways. So the very best way I can think of to bring this series on calling to a close, this series about how we hear and understand, how we discover and live into God's calling, God's purpose for our lives. Best way I can think of to sum this all up is to share what I have learned throughout my own life about God's call through the experiences that I've had. Now, I've shared bits and pieces of this with many of you throughout the years. I shared a lot of this in my very first sermon here at Indian Run almost 10 years ago, and I share bits and pieces in each of our new member classes. So forgive me if it's a little repetitive, but I think it might be helpful as we think about the variety of ways that God might call us and how we might hear that call and how we might answer that call and what that call might mean for our lives. So I've been a part of the church my whole life. My mom was an active leader in the life of the church, and so I found myself always hanging around the church. I was kind of always present at the church. And when I was growing up, I had absolutely no clue that I would end up as a minister. That didn't happen until way later. I was just that kid who always had to be told to stop running in the fellowship hall. And you were there, you remember some of that, don't you? So I was another one of those kids that in my day, all of the high school kids and the middle school kids sat in the kind of front row corner of the sanctuary, and we would just sit and chat and giggle and pass notes and not really pay all that much attention to what was going on, and our parents would glare at us, but I was kind of in that space. I eventually followed my mom's lead, and I got involved in the life of the church. As a high schooler, in my last few years of high school, I joined the church choir. My love for music led me to be a part of that. And at one point during my years, as I was sitting in the choir loft and I was watching the pastor offer his sermon for the morning, I thought to myself, yeah, I think I could do that. And I don't know whether it was just me thinking, yeah, I could tell people what to do, or if it was, I had no sense of a vocational call, but I had this fleeting moment where I thought, yeah, I could do that. But it was just that fleeting moment. Without a second thought about it, I went on to Ohio State, got my degree a business degree in marketing, and I launched myself into a career in technology sales. But back to high school a little bit. While I was in high school, my youth group at my church was not all that active. So I went to the youth group where my friends go to church. And the leaders of that youth group were all young adults. And I thought that was pretty cool. So I said to myself, while I was in that youth group as a high schooler, I said, when I'm a young adult, I want to be like them. I want to be a youth group leader for my local church, and I want to help the kids of the church. I want to help my youth, the youth ministry of my church. And so I was a young adult, and I hadn't done anything like that until one Sunday, the youth pastor at our church came up to my wife and I and said, "Would you be confirmation mentors?" And we said, "Sure, yeah, that sounds like fun." And we didn't realize it at the time, and maybe she didn't know it, or maybe she did know it, but she got us eventually into being youth group leaders at Sunday Night Youth Group. And so we spent a year or two hanging out with the youth and being youth group leaders, and that was an amazing experience. We fell in love with the youth of the church and youth ministry. And then later that summer, I found myself as the leader of a small group of high school students that were going to ASP, to McDowell County, West Virginia. And I was the leader of this group of 6 kids, and I was supposed to tell them how to build this shed on this person's property in a holler in West Virginia. And I thought, I have no idea what I'm doing. Why am I here? What is this all about? And I found that week, I had to rely on God to get me through all of those, because I knew I couldn't do it on my own. I didn't know what I was doing, but God offered me the resources. They had a really great manual that I could use to follow to help the kids through this. So I began to, it was the first week of my life that I've actually fully leaned in and relied on God. And I came home from that experience thinking, yeah, I think I might be called to ministry. And so I talked to my mom about it. I sat down with my mom and I said, "Mom, I think I might be called to ministry." And she said, "Son, you have been on a mountaintop experience, and you need to come down off that mountaintop and get back to work." Because the Lord needs people to fund the work of the church, and you make good money, and you can support the church with that money rather than being one that is being supported by the church. I was like, "Mom, that's not what I wanted to hear." So later that fall, Sandy and I decided to start a disciple Bible study class. And so we engaged in this class, and as a part of that 36-week-long class, it was the length of a school year, throughout that class I began to discern that whether I really was truly being called into ministry. And I did that through the conversations I had with the people in that small group. There were only about 12 people in that small group. Amazing what God can do with 12 people, right? And when we prayed for people, each week during that small group, we talked about the prayer concerns and the people in the church that needed prayer. I found myself beginning to feel led, like I think I need to go visit this person that's in the hospital. And I thought, well, that's weird, because I hate hospitals. I don't want to have anything to do with hospitals. I don't want to set foot in a hospital, but I feel like I should follow through on this prayer time by visiting these people. And I didn't. Not that whole year. I didn't go to the hospital, but I felt that call. I continued to realize that God was working on my heart, and I began to feel a deeper sense of call. And in the last class session of Disciple Bible Study, the group does kind of a mini worship service. And a couple of weeks before that, we go around and we assign parts. Who's going to do what part of the worship service? And we decided that we were just going to go around the circle, and whoever was up whenever that part of the service was up, that's the role you got assigned. And I was kind of hoping it would happen, but sure enough, when it came around to me, I was the one that had to give the message for the worship service. And that was the very first message that I ever gave. By the end of that class in the spring of 2001, I was fairly certain that I had some sense of call to ministry, but I still had no idea what to do with it. And then September 11th, 2001 came. And I was watching the news coverage of that tragedy on the Friday following it. I was getting ready to go to our church's noon. They were having a midday prayer service on that Friday. And so as I was getting ready and watching it, I watched the video footage of the rescuers carrying out the very first known casualty of first named casualty of September 11th. It was Father Michael Judge. And they were carrying his lifeless body out of the wreckage and describing how this priest had been a lifelong, he had made lifelong contributions to the life of the first responder community in New York City. He had been to every baptism and graduation and marriage and funeral and birth for all of the firefighters and the policemen in New York City. And as I was watching and listening to this story of Father Michael Judge, I said to myself, that's, I think, the kind of person that I want to be. I want to be that kind of spiritual guide and mentor and friend and companion to a community of people. And I really began to think of myself as a pastor. And as luck would have it, or maybe it was one of those divine coincidences, the very next weekend I was scheduled to go on a weekend spiritual retreat called the Walk to Emmaus. And throughout that weekend, I wrestled with God about my call to ministry. I felt like I was called, but I kept coming up with reasons why, that can't be me, not Jeff Allen, no way. Who am I to be a pastor? As I thought about how my friends and family would respond, I was the last person that they would think would be a pastor. You know, y'all didn't know me back then. So I felt this sense of iniquity and throughout the weekend in a variety of different ways. Opportunities to be in community with others, opportunities to sit still and listen to the Spirit of God, and communion opportunities. God took every one of those roadblocks that I was setting up, and I have this image of God just flicking them away, just saying, no, that's not important anymore, because you can do this. And so at the end of that weekend, I made a commitment. I said, God, I think I'm being called to ministry. And my commitment to you is that I will do whatever I can to have the courage to take the next step, whatever that next step is. I don't know where this is going to lead. I can't see 5 steps ahead, but I can see the next step. And I'll promise you I'll take that next step. And so in the fall of 2001, I began exploring what it meant to be called into ordained ministry in the United Methodist Church. And I began working through the long and arduous process of getting ordained in our denomination. And one of the very first steps is to read a book that's published by the United Methodist Church called The Christian as Minister. And you're supposed to talk it over with your pastor. The book describes the wide variety of ways that a person can live out a call to ministry in our denomination. The vast majority of these ways that you can live out your call to ministry have nothing at all to do with ordination. Through our baptism, we are all called as Christians to a life of ministry. There are lots of different ways that you can answer God's call. You don't have to be ordained to live a life of ministry. Now, some people, yes, ordination is the right next step for them. And we're here to help if that's your right next step. But you don't have to be on a church staff to live a life of ministry. Like Lydia, you can continue in your day job and still be active in ministry. After reading about all these different ways that God can use you in ministry, and after I talked with my pastor about it, I felt even more certain that God was calling me to ordained ministry. And so the next step was seminary. And I thought I'd do seminary part-time while continuing to work full-time in my sales job. But it only took about a month of seminary to realize that is where my heart would sing. And I just loved it so much, and I thought, I have got to find a job in ministry. But I didn't know how I could do it. I didn't know how we were going to make it if I quit my day job. It was one of those dark nights of the soul seasons of my life. as I wrestled with how to answer God's call, the call I knew God was calling me to do, but also to still be able to pay my bills, to afford life as we knew it. So I started to look for youth pastor jobs, but they were paying about a third of what I was making in my sales career. How is it going to be able to pay for seminary and pay my mortgage and pay my car payments on a youth pastor's salary? I wanted to follow God's call, but I just didn't know how it was going to work. Well, one night, as Sandy and I were driving west along I-270 between 315 and Sawmill Road, we were talking about whether or not I should take a job as a youth pastor, whether I should really go after that kind of a job. And we were just west of 315. I can tell you exactly where we were on 270 when Sandy said, "I think you should do it." And it was a powerful moment for me. It was like the weight of the world had lifted off of my shoulders as the dark cloud of my dark night, as the clouds of the dark night of my soul lifted off of me. I was going to do it. But realize Sandy had been encouraging me all along. She had been saying, yeah, it would be okay if we can make this work. It would be okay. But everything shifted when she said, I think you should. It's all I needed. It gave me the courage to take that next step that God was inviting me and calling me to take. And within a week, I got a call from a friend telling me that there were 3 youth pastor openings in United Methodist churches around Columbus. One of them was here at Indian Run. Eventually, I was hired as the youth pastor at Scioto Ridge, where I served for 4 years as I went to seminary. And I have to tell you, God took care of the finances. After I took that 2/3 pay cut to become a youth pastor, Sandy continued to get promoted in her job to the point where she was able to make up the difference, and I was able to graduate from seminary debt-free. It was amazing. Now, it is absolutely, abundantly, 100% clear to me that answering God's call on my life would not have been possible were it not for the people around me who had answered God's call in their life. And I'm not talking just about the pastors that I talked with. I'm talking about my Sunday school teachers. I'm talking about my Christmas pageant leaders, my youth group leaders, my disciple Bible study leaders, and the other 11 people in disciple Bible study with me, other small group participants that surrounded me as I was discerning, all those people who led the Walk to Emmaus weekend for me. I couldn't be here where I am without the guidance and support of my wife and my family and my friends and my pastors, and from learning from my mom's example of what it means to be active in the life of a church. Answering God's call is never something you do all by yourself. It takes the community around you to help you discern and to live into God's call. And I've also learned that within your wider sense of call, things can change within different seasons of your life. You can be living out your big picture call, but things can change a little bit. For example, there was a time earlier this year when I was trying to discern the upcoming sermon series for our congregation. And I was thinking, what's the right message that would just be the right thing that our church needs to hear right in this season? And I had a couple of ideas, some of which would have been fairly easy for me to do, sermons like ones that I may have done before or like similar themes and things, and some were like a much heavier lift. More research would be involved, more bandwidth in my life would have been required. And I recognize also that I was in a season of my life where my sons were finishing their senior year of high school. And we had lots of stuff going on with their end-of-year celebrations. And I knew that I wouldn't have a ton of extra bandwidth in my life or a lot of extra mental capacity because I would be focused on that. And so I was talking with Pastor Andrea, and she was helping me discern what I should do. And she offered me the invitation to consider that maybe in this season of my life, I needed to focus on being the best father that I could be and not push myself extra hard in my sermon prep. Maybe God was calling me to focus extra attention on my family in this season instead of my work. Not that I didn't need to work hard and write good sermons. I just didn't need to add that extra pressure on myself, that self-imposed pressure in this particular season of life. God was inviting me, God was calling me to be more fully present in this particular season of my life with my family. God calls in a variety of ways, in a variety of, through a variety of people. And when we look at the stories of God's call that we find in the Bible, and when we look at our own stories, we see that God's call comes in those unique ways. Sometimes God's call comes through a quiet little nudge, maybe something we hear in our prayer time, or like my call to maybe go visit people in the hospital. Sometimes God's call comes in a bold vision like Isaiah had with an image of God and angels, and you hear the voice of God clearly, and yes, Lord, this is what I need to do. Sometimes God's call comes through our relationships. Sometimes God's call comes through the gifts that we already have. Sometimes God's call comes when we identify something that we feel is wrong with the world, and we hear God saying, "Who shall I send?" And we say, "Yes, it's me. Send me, because I think I can contribute in some way to address this issue." And God's call leads us all to different kinds of responses. Sometimes we refuse God's call. Sometimes we push it to the side. Sometimes we answer God's call by serving or loving or giving or leading or supporting the leadership of others or encouraging others. But the common thread is this: God calls every single one of us to something. God calls us to use who we are and what we have for the sake of God's work in this world. So the real question is not whether God is calling you. The question is, how will you answer when God says, "Whom shall I send?" My prayer is that we might all be ready to say with Isaiah, "Here I am, send me."